Hello, it's ch5&6, the instructor for the online section of Marketing Communication Planning. Thanks for watching this video for week 2, just to provide an overview, highlighting some of the key points in the reading and connecting them to our project. In chapter 5, we're learning all about the communication process and how it starts with a source or a sender, and there's a message that that sender is trying to get to the receiver, and on the way, that message gets encoded through whatever way the sender creates and crafts that message, whether it's through words or music. And that message also goes through a noisy market to ultimately get to the receiver, who decodes the message based on his or her own experiences, and then hopefully responds to that message and therefore gives feedback to the original sender. And that's a highlight of the process, but obviously there's a lot involved with each step of this process. But it's important to understand it because communication is all about passing information from the source to the sender, or from the source to the receiver. And so as marketing communication professionals, that's what we're doing every day. There's a message we're trying to communicate for our project. It's for our client, and we're trying to get that message to the target audience. And so it's important to understand how best to do that by understanding the communication process. Our book goes through a bunch of different models to help us understand the process from the point that consumers or that the receivers get that information to the point that they make some sort of decision or take some sort of action based on that information. And whether we're talking about the sales process or the advertising process or the new product adoption process, these models look a lot alike. They start with some sort of cognitive stage where we're trying to get the consumer to think a certain way about the product or to perceive it a certain way. And then it moves on to the affective stage where we want them to feel a certain way about the product. Hopefully they'll like it. And then ultimately, at the behavioral stage, we want them to act, to buy the product, to try the product, or in some other way act upon the message they initially received. So this figure shows the methods of obtaining feedback in the response hierarchy. And it basically shows you, of the different responses that we are trying to evoke, whether we're trying to get them exposed to the product, or we're trying to get their attention, or to get them to comprehend the communication message that we're sending, accept that message, retained, or to actually purchase. There are different things we would do to assess whether or not we were effective at doing that. So we could, use the viewer or listening audience size as a way to determine whether or not we're getting the exposure that we're looking for. We could use viewer recognition, to see if we're getting their attention. We could use brand recall, to see if they're really comprehending the message. And in this case, we would want to test the recall of the message. And I won't go through them all. But the key here is, even though our client is small and may not be able to afford the research required to measure some of these things like recall, it's still important to know what could be used to determine the effectiveness of the communication strategy at each stage in this process. Another model that's discussed in our reading is this model that involves processing information based on the level of involvement and the level of differentiation of the product. So, consumers can have low involvement, or they can have high involvement depending on the product category, how much time and effort they have to invest in shopping for it. That's the context we normally think of. Low and high involvement is kind of in the decision-making process. But in this situation, if there's a lot of product differentiation, obviously they're going to be more into that process. They're going to be more active in that process. So, you know, the 3 stages that we talked about, thinking, feeling, and doing, or, cognitive, affective, and conative or behavioral, that's the order that they would take. But if it's a low involvement process, that order may switch. They may think and then just make a decision to buy. That's the conative or the behavioral. Now, later on, they may have some feelings about that, but they're not necessarily, um, waiting to buy because it's a low involvement model. That's why the right side of the screen sort of goes, the next step is behavioral. So this just helps you to understand, based on involvement and product differentiation, the sort of the process that goes on for the consumer. So there's also this social consumer decision journey in the book that sort of gives us a highlight of how the process of influencing consumers' actions and activities and decisions in social networks is sort of different than some of the other models that we saw. The other models were very linear, very straightforward, sort of one direction. And these, I guess there's one direction here, but they're not so linear. There are some options, a couple of paths you could take. So it's important to know that your consumer can be considering your product, evaluating your product, bonding with your product, all as part of this process through different mediums. So your website, your YouTube, they could be getting input from consumers that have used the product, maybe through feedback. So this model is more catered to help us understand what this decision journey looks like, how consumers consider, evaluate, buy, and enjoy, advocate, or bond with your product. Another framework, there are lots of frameworks in this reading. So another one helps us understand sort of at a high level how advertising works. And in a nutshell, once the advertising communication happens and it's filtered through different factors like the level of motivation and involvement of the person that you're targeting, we still have that golden 3-pronged section there under consumer that has cognition, affect, and experience. So it's a little different wording in this model, but nonetheless, there's still that aspect of thinking, that aspect of feeling, and here experience has to do more with the feedback dimension that's based on product purchase for that particular consumer. So understanding that communication process is important. Looking more specifically at the source, the message, and the channel is what we do in Chapter 6. The source is the initiator of that message, and there are a lot of factors, not a lot, 3 key factors that are discussed in the book that will impact the source and how the source is perceived. One is credibility. If it's a credible source, then that is a source that's more likely to be trusted by the consumer or the receiver, and then they're more likely to take that message and to internalize that message. If it's a trusted source that's seen as not being biased and sort of has an objective viewpoint. If the source is attractive, and by attractive that means it's a source that the receiver can relate to or feels is likable, then that is a source that's more likely to be, the message is more likely to be received by the receiver, and they have a sense that they can identify with that source. So there's some connection there. They feel like, well, I can connect with them. Maybe we have the same beliefs about something or the same attitudes or behaviors. Power is another factor that affects the source. If the source has some level of power that they can reward or punish the receiver, then that will impact this process, because the receiver then, you know, feels that they have to comply with the source. You know, so the level of compliance is based on the level of power that that source has. Now, the message factors that are discussed in our book there are actually quite a few. Excuse me, there are quite a few of them. And it has to do with both the structure of the message and then the type of message appeal that's used. So in terms of structure, there are a couple things discussed, whether you put the important parts early in the message or late in the message makes a difference. But early or late's better than in the middle. Does the message draw conclusions for the receiver? Is it one-sided, or does it show both sides? Does it refute any potential objections to the message? Is it both verbal and visual? So those are some of the things that affect the process of, you know, how well the message is received. And then also the appeal, the type of appeal, these are also factors in the message. Is it using some sort of comparative appeal that's comparing it directly or maybe indirectly to another product or service in the same category? Is it using fear? Is it trying to appeal to the fear, you know, to using a fear tactic, or is it using humor to try to evoke a certain response from the receiver? There are pros and cons to using both. Now, this is not to be confused with advertising appeals, which are similar. This is specifically talking about the message, but when we get to the point where we're making recommendations on the creative part of it, the advertising appeal goes far beyond just fear and humor. There are other, you know, types of advertising appeals that we'll learn all about, I believe, in chapter 9, so we'll hold off on that, but stay tuned. So in addition to the source and the message, the channel also has a number of factors that affect this overall communication process, whether it's a personal or non-personal channel. You know, personal selling is a personal channel. Television is not a personal channel. There are some other facts in terms of how the information gets processed. So if a channel is self-paced, that means the receiver can sort of take his time and review the information at his or her own pace. So that's something like browsing the internet or reading a newspaper. Whereas something like a radio ad or TV ad is just out there for that limited amount of time, and you can't rewind it. Or, I mean, I suppose on TV you can, but you don't really control the pace that information comes at you. That affects the whole process. And there are other effects in terms of the medium you use. So the medium you use says a lot about, it can actually affect the perspective of the receiver. So certain media channels have a certain perception, and that affects this whole process. It has, there are certain cable news networks that are perceived a certain way. Maybe their information tends to be skewed or seen as biased toward a certain position, and there are others that may be biased towards another position. So even advertising within those networks, you are already in the context of a medium that is perceived a certain way. So that certainly affects the process and the message getting to the receiver and how it might be interpreted. And of course, any clutter, any other advertising in that medium would certainly affect this overall process.